My name is Lauren. I'm 28 years old, and this happened over a period of about 4 months when I was living alone for the first time in my life. I had just moved to a new city for a job. I didn't know many people yet. I want to establish that up front because it's relevant. I had no social network in place, no one nearby who knew my routines, no one who would have noticed quickly if something had gone wrong. The apartment was on the third floor of a building in a quiet residential neighborhood. Nice area. Low crime. The kind of street where people walk dogs in the evening and say hello to each other. I felt safe there immediately, which is probably why it took me as long as it did to understand what was happening. It started with a phone. I found it on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was leaving for work, locking my front door, and I nearly stepped on it, a phone sitting face down on the mat outside my apartment. No case, no identifying marks. I picked it up and turned it over. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. No lock screen. No passcode. My first thought was that a neighbor had dropped it. I looked down the hallway in both directions. Nobody there. I took it inside, intending to check for contact or a saved number I could call to return it. I opened the Photos app because it was the first thing I thought of. People usually have photos of themselves or their families that might help identify them. The most recent photo had been taken 2 days earlier. It was a picture of my living room window, taken from outside from street level looking up. You could see the light on inside. You could see the faint outline of furniture through the curtain. I scrolled back. The photo before that was my front door, taken from the hallway inside the building. The one before that was me, walking from my car to the building entrance, taken from across the street, clear enough that you could read the logo on my work bag. I kept scrolling. There were 43 photos on that phone. Every single one was of me, my building, or my apartment. The oldest was dated 6 weeks after I had moved in. Someone had been documenting me for over 2 months before I found that phone. Some of the photos were taken during the day, some at night. Several were taken through my window from outside, angles that would have required standing in the narrow side alley that ran along the building. At least 8 were taken inside the building, in the hallway outside my door, at distances close enough that the photographer could have reached out and touched the door while taking them. I called the police that same morning. 2 officers came. They looked through the phone. They were professional about it, but I could tell immediately that the framing of the conversation was moving toward a direction I didn't want it to go. Had I recently ended a relationship? Did I have a coworker or acquaintance who might have a fixation? Was there anyone I'd had conflict with? The questions were reasonable, but they felt like the beginning of a process that was going to take a long time and produce nothing fast. They took the phone as evidence. They told me to document anything unusual and to call if I felt in immediate danger. They said they would follow up. That night I went through my own apartment, looking at every window from inside. I checked what was visible from outside based on where the photos had been taken. From the alley angle, you could see directly into my bedroom if the curtains weren't fully closed. I had been leaving a 2-inch gap on one side because the curtain rod was slightly short. I had never thought about it. I closed it and pushed my dresser in front of that window. I bought a door security bar and a chain lock that same week. I started varying my schedule, leaving at different times, taking different routes. I told my building manager what had happened and asked him to check the hallway camera footage. He came back 2 days later and told me the camera in my hallway had been offline for 3 weeks due to a technical issue and had only recently been repaired. 3 weeks of no footage. The police followed up once, about 10 days after I'd reported it. They told me the phone had no registered owner. It was a prepaid device bought with cash. No fingerprints beyond partials that weren't in any database. No leads they could pursue actively. They told me to stay alert. For the next 6 weeks I lived in a state of low-grade constant fear, that I tried very hard not to let become consuming. I checked the hallway before leaving. I sat with my back to the wall in restaurants. I started keeping a log of anything that felt slightly off: a car parked in an unusual spot, a person I saw twice in unrelated locations, sounds outside my door at odd hours. Most of it was probably nothing. The log helped me feel like I had some control. Then, about 7 weeks after I found the phone, I came home from work and found something on my doormat again. A single photograph, printed on regular paper, slightly blurry, like it had been printed on a home printer. It was a photo of me at my desk at work, taken through the window of my office from outside the building. I was on the second floor. The angle suggested whoever took it had been standing on something to get the height. On the back, in small, neat handwriting, were 4 words. "I see you working." I did not go inside my apartment. I went back downstairs and sat in my car and called the police, and then called my sister in another city and talked to her until the officers arrived. I broke my lease 2 weeks later. The building manager was understanding when I explained the situation. I moved into a furnished short-term rental under a friend's name while I figured out a longer-term plan. The police never identified anyone. The case is technically still open. I live somewhere else now. Different city, different building, different name on the buzzer. I have blackout curtains on every window and a camera on my front door that I check every morning before I leave. The worst part isn't the fear. The fear has faded to something manageable. The worst part is knowing that somewhere in those 43 photos, taken over 2 months, there are probably dozens of moments where I walked past whoever it was without knowing. Moments where they were close enough to photograph me and I felt nothing, noticed nothing, kept walking. I think about that more than anything else. My name is Kevin. This happened over about 5 months, starting in the winter of 2020. I was working as a night shift supervisor at a large warehouse distribution center outside of Portland. 12-hour shifts, 4 nights a week, rotating schedule that changed every few weeks. I drove the same route to work every night, about 22 minutes of mostly highway and 2 surface streets. I want to describe the route because it matters. The highway portion was fine, busy even at night, well lit. But the last stretch involved turning off onto a 2-lane road that ran through an unlit industrial corridor before reaching the warehouse entrance. About 1.5 miles of dark road with no businesses open at night, no pedestrian traffic, no reason for anyone to be there except people heading to one of the 3 or 4 facilities in that corridor. It was on that stretch where I first noticed the truck. Dark blue pickup, older model, no distinguishing marks. The first time I saw it, it was parked on the gravel shoulder about 1/4 mile from the warehouse entrance with its lights off. I registered it as probably a coworker who'd pulled over to take a call, or someone from another facility. I drove past and didn't think about it again. The second time was 4 nights later. Same truck, same spot, lights off. I slowed down slightly as I passed. There was someone in the driver's seat, but I couldn't make out anything clearly in the dark. Third time a week after that. Same truck, same spot. This time I noticed the engine wasn't running, no exhaust visible in the cold air. Whoever it was had been sitting there in the dark with the engine off, on a road with no reason to be on, unless you were going to one of those facilities. I mentioned it to one of my coworkers, a guy named Dale who also drove that route. He said he'd seen the truck a couple times too, but assumed it was someone from the freight company across the road waiting for a late delivery. That explanation made enough sense that I mostly let it go. Then the notes started. I found the first one under my windshield wiper in the employee parking lot. A small piece of paper folded once. On it was written, "You took your break at 2:17 tonight." That's earlier than usual. I stood in the parking lot at the end of my shift, holding that piece of paper, running through every possible explanation. A prank from a coworker. Something I was misreading. I went back inside and asked around casually. Nobody admitted to it. Nobody seemed to know what I was talking about. I took my break at 2:17 that night because a shipment had come in early and I'd adjusted. It wasn't posted anywhere. It wasn't something anyone outside the building would have known unless they had been watching the entrance, watching who went in and out of the side door we used for breaks and at what time. The second note was 9 days later. Under my wiper again. You parked in a different spot tonight. Row C instead of row B. Did something happen? I had parked in row C because row B was full when I arrived. A completely ordinary, unplanned decision made in the moment. Someone had noticed. Someone had compared it to my usual behavior and found it notable enough to write down and leave on my windshield. I went to my manager and showed him both notes. He took them seriously. To his credit, he didn't minimize it, and he contacted the security team and asked them to review parking lot footage. The cameras covered most of the lot, but there was a blind spot along the far fence line. Both times my car had been parked close enough to that blind spot that whoever left the notes could have approached from that direction without being captured. We couldn't see anyone. We couldn't identify anyone. I started varying everything I could. Different parking spots, different break times, occasionally a different route to work, adding 10 minutes to avoid that industrial corridor stretch entirely. For 2 weeks, nothing happened, no notes. No truck on the shoulder. Then I came out one morning after my shift and found my car had been moved. Not stolen, moved. It was in a different spot in the same lot, about 6 rows from where I had parked it. My keys had been in my locker inside. The car showed no signs of being broken into. When I had it checked by a mechanic, he found a magnetic GPS tracker attached to the underside of the rear bumper. The police took the tracker. They told me these devices were sold commercially and were difficult to trace. They took a report and recommended I install a security system on my vehicle. I transferred to a different facility 3 weeks later, one with a different route, a different schedule, a different parking structure with 24-hour camera coverage. I didn't tell many people where I was going or when. The truck was never identified. The notes were never traced. The person who moved my car was never found. What I think about now, over 3 years later, is the patience of it. Whoever it was didn't escalate quickly. They watched for months before the notes started. They documented small details, break times, parking spots, that had no obvious purpose except to demonstrate that they were paying attention. They wanted me to know they were watching. They just didn't want me to know who they were. My name is Rachel. What I'm about to describe is something I've told very few people because every time I do, I watch them arrive at the same conclusion my husband arrived at before me, that there is a simple explanation, that I misremembered, that I was stressed or sleep-deprived, or letting small things build into something bigger than they were. I understand why people land there. I would have landed there too before I found the crawl space. We bought the house in the spring of 2019. 4-bedroom colonial on a cul-de-sac. Previous owners had lived there for 11 years. The inspection was clean. The neighborhood was quiet. We moved in with our 2 kids, aged 7 and 9, and spent the first month doing small renovations, painting, new fixtures, replacing carpet in the upstairs hallway. The first thing I noticed was the food. About 6 weeks after we moved in, I started finding small discrepancies in the kitchen. Nothing dramatic at first. A can of soup I was certain I hadn't opened, sitting in the recycling bin. Crackers that I thought had been full, now half empty. A glass in the drying rack that I didn't remember washing. I assumed it was my husband or one of the kids and didn't think about it much. We were all adjusting to a new house and new routines. I mentioned it once at dinner, and my husband said it was probably him snacking late and forgetting. That was enough for me at the time. Then I started noticing things in the basement. We used the basement mainly for storage, boxes we hadn't fully unpacked, holiday decorations, the kids' off-season sports equipment. I went down there maybe once a week. Around the 2-month mark, I started noticing that things had shifted. Not dramatically. A box that I remembered being flush against the wall was pulled out a few inches. A folding chair that had been leaning in one corner was now leaning in another. Small things, things that were easy to attribute to someone going through storage looking for something. When I mentioned the basement to my husband, he said he'd been down there a few times looking for tools. That made sense. I let it go. What I couldn't let go was the smell. Our basement had a particular smell when we moved in, the normal smell of an older basement, slightly damp, slightly dusty. Clean enough but distinctly underground. Sometime around month 3, I started noticing a different smell on certain mornings when I opened the basement door. Faint but unmistakable. Something lived in. Something human. The particular smell of a space where a person has been recently. I didn't say anything to my husband about the smell because I knew how it would sound. Instead, I started paying closer attention. I began keeping a mental note of exactly where things were in the basement each time I went down. I kept the basement door locked at night. It had a lock on it, which I'd thought was odd when we moved in and now found reassuring. For 2 weeks, nothing changed. The smell faded. I told myself I had imagined it. Then one Tuesday morning in November, I went to the basement to get a box of winter clothes. I moved 2 storage boxes away from the back wall to reach the shelf behind them, and I saw it. A section of the wall paneling, about 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall, was not flush with the rest. There was a slight gap along one edge. I pulled at it. It swung outward on 2 hinges that had been installed on the inside. Behind it was a crawl space that ran along the back wall of the basement. About 4 feet deep, the full width of the house. Low ceiling, you'd have to crouch or lie down to move through it. Dark. I shone my phone flashlight inside. There was a sleeping bag rolled out on a flattened piece of cardboard. A water bottle. 3 cans of food, the same brand we bought, with a small manual can opener next to them. A dark jacket folded neatly. And a phone charger plugged into an extension cord that ran along the back wall to an outlet I hadn't known was there. I left the basement immediately, locked the door, got my children out of the house, and called the police from my car. 4 officers searched the house and the crawl space. They found no one inside. But they confirmed everything I had found, the sleeping area, the food, the charger. They found something else I hadn't seen, a small spiral notebook pushed into the corner near the sleeping bag. The detective who spoke to me later told me there were entries in the notebook. He didn't show it to me, but he described it. Dates going back almost 2 months from when I found the space. Short observations. What time the lights went off at night. What time I or my husband left in the morning. What the kids' schedule seemed to be. Notes about which days the basement door was left unlocked. Whoever it was had been there since shortly after we moved in. They had been sleeping in our basement, eating our food, charging their phone, and keeping a log of our family's movements for 2 months, while we lived our normal lives 30 feet above them. The police identified a suspect from a partial print on the water bottle. A man in his late 30s with a history of trespassing and a prior incident involving a different family's home in another state. He was arrested 3 weeks later at a shelter about 40 miles away. He told police he had found the crawl space before we bought the house. He had known about it because he had broken into the property once while it was vacant. He had simply come back after we moved in. We sold the house 8 months later. I could not make myself feel safe there again, no matter what we changed or fixed or locked. My kids never found out the full story. I told them we moved because of my husband's job. The thing I come back to most is not the fear of what could have happened, though that's there too. It's the mornings. All those ordinary mornings where I made coffee and got the kids ready for school and felt completely safe in my own home. He was there for all of them,